Hey, what is up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. Today we're in the second in a short series on this review slider, and you can come in here and click these little buttons and it'll just jump to the next thing. And there's a few things to know about this. This is dynamically generated, and then also we've got some cool stuff like this styling, and today we're going to be working on this where you've got this gradient shadow going on. And even around the images, you've got a gradient shadow and then this kind of highlighter effect on the title. So today we're going to work on the CSS. Last time we worked on the HTML, and next time will be the fun stuff, the JavaScript. But don't leave yet. If you want to follow along with me, I've got a repo in the description. You can just come in here and grab the lesson 2 starting point, and then you can either download the code here yourself. You can, of course, just clone the whole thing, or you can fork it, whatever you want. But you can follow along with me there if you'd like to. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. This is where we left it off last time. And today we need to start by running in here and adding a link to our CSS. So I'm just going to link it just like that. We'll just call it style.css. That works for me. Then I'm going to come over here and let's add a new file. And again, you guessed it, style.css. And that's where we're going to start. So let's pull this up and collapse the sidebar. Let's refresh this just to make sure it's working. I'm going to do a few things up top here that I don't think you need to watch me do, but I'll talk you through them. First of all, we're going to go ahead and grab every element and then every after and before element and just do some basic clears here, removing border, margin padding, and setting the box sizing to border box. So things will act a little bit more predictably. Next, I've gone ahead and imported a Google font here called Enter. I've used this on some of my pages before. And then I've declared the root variable, or the root, which is essentially the HTML. And I've added a bunch of color to these variables. So I've got 2 text colors, 2 background colors, 2 accent colors, and then a gradient that just sets a linear gradient based on the accent colors themselves. All right, so I figured you probably don't need to watch me do that. If you want to grab that, again, the code is in the description if you don't want to type it all out yourself. All right, and if I save here, you'll see that it already starts to update just a little bit, but our font's not actually being used. So let's grab our body here, and the first thing we'll do is say font family, and then we'll say enter, and then set sans serif as the default if that doesn't load properly. Now we're going to do a few things here. You remember we have this SVG background, this pattern background. That's actually an SVG, but it actually has a transparent layer, and so we need to add a color to the background. So let's go ahead and do that, and we're going to say a background color should be our var of background 1. And that's this light color up this way. You'll see that's kind of an off blue, a white blue color. And then before we start adding that pattern in, let's go ahead and set the min height on this. It's a min height of 100 view height. That ensures it always takes up the full width, full height of the page. And then we'll set this to display grid and place items center. That will place everything in the very center of the page. Next, let's go ahead and declare a color here on everything. So all the text color should share this text 1 unless we alter it somehow in the CSS later on. And finally, let's add a padding of 2 rem all the way around to give ourselves a little bit more breathing room on the page. Now, I promised that background image, so let's do that. The background image, and we're going to set this to URL, and then we're going to grab the images, and in here I've got a pattern.svg. If I save it here, you see that that should pop up, and where I got that pattern from is this pattern generator. And the way this works is you pick a pattern, you set colors. I've actually gone ahead and saved mine to local storage. So if I click this, this will show what I've got set here. And I can actually just download this as an SVG. That's what I've done. I put it in my images folder. But I think this is a pretty cool little generator. And so I'll leave a link in the description if you want to look at that. All right, so we've got our body. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit more space. And this whole area was in a div called review container. So review container, let's go ahead and grab that. We're going to set the background color of this to our var of background 2. And that's a white color. And then we'll set a border radius. This is just the outside kind of curvature of 0.5 rem. That's around the corners here. You see there's just a slight little bending now. We're going to set this as position of relative, and I'll show you why later on. And then we'll do text align of center. So everything should start in the center, and then we can adjust it as we need to. Now you might remember on our finished product, we have this cool little drop shadow that's actually a gradient drop shadow. And we're going to accomplish that with a pseudo element. So I'll say review container, and we're going to grab the before pseudo element here. You always have to have a content here, so even if you don't have anything in it, you have to have it empty there. And then we're going to say this needs to be position absolute. That's why we actually set the position relative up top so that this could be within that, that container, the review container. I'm going to use the inset property and set it to 0. That's the same as saying top 0, right 0, left 0, and bottom 0. It's not got perfect adoption across all browsers, but it's good enough for all modern ones. So I'm going to stick it at that for now. We'll do a border radius of 0.5 rem as well. Now the background here is going to be our var of gradient. Remember, I set that up top here, and it just goes right to left, and then it starts with accent 1 and finishes with accent 2. You see it's actually over the entire thing right now, and so we need to do a little bit of work here. So first, let's go ahead and say z. Well, before we move it behind, let's transform it so you can see it actually moving in real time. So we're going to translate it. This is x and y. We'll do 0.45% and 0.55%. So a little more down than it is right. And then we're also going to change the scale actually and make it just a little bit smaller. So we'll do 0.9495, something like that, of the actual size of the container it's in. So if I save here, you see it actually moves over and down. And now let's go ahead and come back up here and change the z index to -1. That should put it just behind. Now, if a browser doesn't support blur, which is what we're going to do next, that's what they'll see. And although it's not the most amazing thing ever, I still think it looks cool enough, and so I'm not going to worry about backward browser compatibility. Like I mentioned, we're going to have a blur on this, so I'm going to do filter of blur, and I'll just set this at 10 pixels, something like that. As I save it there, you see it blur out, and I don't mind that, but I want it to just be backed off just a touch, so we're going to set the opacity to 0.4, and that will make it a little bit more subtle. I think that's kind of a cool effect to have a gradient drop shadow there, or background shadow that's blurred. Next, let's work on that review header area that says what our clients say and all that section. So we'll say review header, and this is going to be a display grid, and we'll do a gap here of 2 rem, and then a margin bottom of 2 rem as well, and a padding of 2 rem up top, 2 rem side to side, and 0 down. As I say that, you see it starts to space everything out properly. Let's grab the review header here, and I'm just doing standard CSS, so that's why I'm redeclaring all these. So hopefully you don't mind that. Now I need to add a position of relative, and that's because we're going to have another pseudo element based off of this h2. And we need to set the font size of this, and I'm going to use something that I showed on a recent video, and it's called a clamp property. I'm going to go ahead and use Keyboard Maestro, which I again showed in that video briefly, but you can also generate this with your own functions, and again I showed you how to do that in that video. But I'm going to say at the smallest, at 350 pixels, I want it to be 1.3 rem. At the largest, which would be 1000 pixels, it's going to scale all the way until it gets to 2.8 rem, and then after that it's going to hold at 2.8 rem. That's what that all means, and it's going to calculate it for me and drop it right in there. So if I save this here, you'll see it's rather large, but if I were to get smaller, it would get smaller all the way down until it got to 350 pixels, at which point it would hook and stop at that 1.3 rem. And before I do too much more, let's go ahead and grab the review header h2, and we're going to grab here the before pseudo element. Just like above, we've got to add some kind of content, even if there isn't any. We're going to set this to position of absolute, and then our inset again of 0. Now here we're going to add that same background var of gradient, and I'm going to scroll down to give myself a little more room. And then let's go ahead and add a z index here of -1. That will bring it back behind the text, but notice it also brings it behind everything else. This has to do with stacking order, but basically you can fix this by saying z index of 0 here, and now that should bring it back up. And then the next thing we want to do is transform it. So we're going to say transform. We're going to translate it down as all. So we'll bring it down 120%. And then I also want to scale it actually a little bit up, and I'll show you why I'm wanting to do that in just a second. Because if I save it here, you'll see it goes down, and it actually gets bigger, and it's not right behind the text. I'll fix that in a second here, but the first thing I want to do is set the height to 50% of the parent, and so that will only be half of it, and that brings it kind of where we want it to. We're going to set a little bit of a filter blur on it. If somebody doesn't have this in their browser, again, it's not a huge deal. It's not like it looks horrible right now. We'll just set 1 pixel blur on it, and then in order to get to hug the sides of that H2, I'll come up here and just do a margin of auto, which smashes everything together, and that's what our finished product looks like. Now we've also got our review header paragraph here, so review header P. We're going to set the color of the text here to our var of text2. If I save here, you see it's that grayish kind of gray color. Okay, so that's the top of the page. Now the only thing we've got left is the review container section. I'll warn you, this is kind of the longer section, so buckle in, but I don't think it's too different than what we've done before. So review content here, we're going to say this needs to, again, be position of relative. We're going to use that position relative and the position absolute on those buttons to set them in the right spot. The first thing I want to do is I want to clamp it to a max width of 750 pixels. In other words, I never want it to get larger than that. And as I save it, you see it kind of scooches in just a bit already. I'm also, though, going to set a width, and we're going to calculate this to 100 view width minus 4 rem. That's our padding on the sides. And again, it's capping it at 750 pixels as well. We will go ahead and add a little bit of padding up, down, and below, so rem. That will give our content a little bit more breathing space up and down so it doesn't clip anything. And that would happen because we're going to set an overflow of hidden on here. That's how we're going to move the items left and right. They're going to be hidden when they're not in frame here. And before we start working with the reviews themselves, let's go ahead and situate those arrows where we need them to be. You might remember that both of them have a class of arrow, and then they each have their own ID. So let's go ahead and grab the class of arrow first. We're going to say these need to be position of absolute. And then we're going to say they need to be top 50%, which is halfway down the parent container there. That actually brings the top of those buttons to exactly 50% of the parent container. So now we need to translate Y back up negative 50%. Now we don't want a background on these, so we'll say background of none. And then padding, we'll do 0.4 rem just to make sure the finger tapping target is big enough for somebody on a mobile device. We'll set the color of the text to our var of text2. Now you might say, well, how can you style these SVGs with a text color? You might remember we set the SVGs to current color for the stroke. That uses the text color so that as we update our variable, it'll actually shift and change if we wanted to. We want to make sure this stays on top of everything else on our page, so let's do a z-index of 1, and then we're going to transition all 300 milliseconds ease in. Let's do in and out. There we go. And then we'll do a cursor of pointer. If I save this here, it doesn't look too different, but now you'll see if I hover, I'm getting that cursor. We need to now move the left and right one the right ways, but we'll do that in just a second. First of all, we want to update the color when we hover over either of these arrows. So we'll say arrow, and then we'll do an is selector here, and then we'll select both the hover and the focus. These are kind of new ways to select things with this is selector. It just makes it a little quicker. We'll do our var text of 1. And now if I save this and come over here, now when I hover, it'll actually transition because I've got this transition on it here. It's a nice smooth in and out. Now just in case we were to click on those SVGs, we don't want to click on them. So we're going to say arrow SVG, and then we're going to set those SVGs pointer events to none. So you can't actually click on the SVGs anymore, only the buttons themselves. Now let's go ahead and get the right and the left one where they need to be. So we're going to say arrow of right. This needs to be right of 4%. That will move it all the way over to the right. Let's say I think I need an extra dash there. Okay, there we go. It moves all the way to the right, just 4% off the right side. That will give us room to let it move to the right when we hover over it, which I'll show you how we're going to do here in just a second. That's going to give us room here so that when we hover over it or when we focus on it, so we'll do the same kind of selector, hover or focus. When either of those things happen, we're actually going to transform it, move it a little bit. So we'll say transform, translate, and this is X and Y, so 10% to the right, and then we always want it to stay at 50%. And this 50% just matches up here. So in other words, we don't want to change that. We just want to change the X axis. So now if I come over here and hover, it should be moving that way. And again, I forgot the double dash. Okay, there we go. We're going to be copying the left one down, so hopefully I won't forget that as we copy it down. If we go to our finished product, we see behind here we've got this little bubble that kind of expands as we hover over it. So that's what we're going to do next. And as you guessed, we're going to do that with another pseudo selector. So I'll come in here and grab arrow right, except this time we're going to grab RB4. And a lot of it is going to be the same as what we've done up top here. So let me go ahead and start like this. Now we've got a few things that we're going to change here. For instance, we want a border radius on here. So border radius of 50%. That will make a full circle. Radius. Next, we need to change this transform property. We're going to say translate. This is both X and Y. We want 20%. That's to the right, and then negative 2%. That's from its parent up. And that just seemed to put it right in the middle. I guess I could put display grid on the button and then place item center, but this is just what I did. And so that's what we're going to do. All right, and then we'll scale it back just a little bit. We'll have the same filter blur on here. We will have a transition of all 250 milliseconds ease in and out. But we're going to actually set this height a little bit differently. There are these new properties called inline size. And we're going to set that to a min of either 50 pixels or 100%, whatever is smaller. And we'll copy this down and do the same thing for the block size. If you haven't heard of inline size, let's go inline size or block size. Both of these are a way of defining things left and right and then up and down for block. And it depends on the writing mode of the browser that's coming. So in other words, it can adjust as needed depending on the client. So that's what those are. And you can check all those out in the description. Now, since I've saved it, you see this little thing popping up here right now. But as I hover, you'll notice that it goes to the right, and I don't really want that. So I actually want it to move back to the left and get bigger. So we're going to do this. We're going to say on arrow, 2 dashes, right, on hover, where you want to grab the before element. And then let's copy this down, or copy it again here, and say also on focus. So whether they navigate to it with keyboard, or if they move their cursor over, either way, I'm now going to say transform, translate needs to be 4% rather than the 20%. So it moves back to the left 16%. Keep it same up and down. So we'll set that to 2% and then a scale of 0.8. So it gets just a little bit bigger. So if I save it and come back over here, now it does just what I'd expect. Okay, now we've got to switch all these around except just the right. So let me grab all these and copy them down. And now what we're going to do is we're going to update all these to say left. So let's grab that right, that right, that right. What are the ones we have here? That right, and that right. And let's change these all to left. Now this isn't going to quite work here because I need to adjust these transform translate amounts. So this needs to be negative 10%. This needs to be negative 20%. And this needs to be negative 4%. If I save it, now it should do just what I want. Okay, so we had a lot to do, but once we did it, it was easy to apply to now the arrow left. Now, the only section we have left then is the review section itself with the images and all of that. So go ahead and grab reviews, and this is the div that holds all our reviews. We're just going to set this to display of flex. Now right now that's not going to do anything because we only have one review. So what we need is several other child containers, child elements here. So I've got this review here. Let's just copy this down multiple times. So review, review, review. We've got a bunch of them now. If I come over here, they all try to stack up in here. Now we can control how these individual reviews work with the review class without the S. Those are the individual items here. So first let's set a padding on them. So we'll do padding up top, nothing, 2 rem right and left, and then 2 rem down. And then we're going to use the flex property to say we want it to take up the full width. That's a 1 for flex grow, 0 for flex shrink. So don't get any smaller than the full width of the parent. And then we want it to be 100% when it can be. So if I save this here, it's going to look like all the other ones disappeared. You might remember though that up top here we added our overflow of hidden. Let's remove this. And if I do that, now you'll see that they all stack just like this, one after the other. What we're going to do is then drag the reviews, that actual div that holds all the individual reviews. That's confusing with 2 S's, but the div here, we're going to drag it to the left. And because its parent has overflow hidden, as it moves to the left, the next reviews would be over here, and then the second one would come in. All right, hopefully that makes sense. As we get into the JavaScript, that should clear up for you. Right now I'm going to leave that off just so we can make sure everything looks correct. For these individual items, then we want to say display of grid, and we're going to say max width of 100%, just to make sure that if for some reason the images get wonky on really small screens, it never expands past, and then place items of center. We'll do a gap of 1.3 rem to space things out up and down. If I save it here, they start to spread out kind of as we'd like them to. Go ahead and work now on the image itself. So review headshot is what that div is called, and then we had an image inside of that, and I'll tell you why in a second here. We We want the inline size, that's left to right in most languages, to be 120 pixels. That's the width. And then border radius of 50%. Okay, so what we've done here is we've set that to only 120 pixels wide, and then the border radius obviously to 50%. Now, why do we have this inside of a div? If I come back over to my HTML, we see our kind of mock review here. I've got a div and then an image inside of it. You'll notice something. Oh, that's the wrong one. Let's see, where is the image? Up here. You'll notice something about this image tag, and that is that it doesn't have a closing tag element. And in order to use a before or an after pseudo element, you need that. So what I'm actually doing is using the before after pseudo element of the review headshot div and using that to basically populate that little outline that we're going to show you. Now, there are other ways to do this, but that's how I've chosen to do it here. So I'm going to say review headshot. And we're going to grab the before pseudo element here. And just like we did up top here, let's go ahead and grab all this on the arrow. And we'll adjust a few things, but mostly keep it the same. Before we do too much more though, let's go ahead and remember that in order to set a review or a position absolute on that before pseudo element, I need to actually have the headshot here, the div itself, have position of relative. I'm going to save it there. And now let's come down here to our before pseudo element. We need to update just a couple of things. First of all, we don't need this transition. Nothing is transitioning. We also don't need these sizes. It's just going to take up the full width and height of the parent. We're not going to translate it at all, but we do want to change the scale just a bit. Rather than making it smaller though, we're going to make it a little bit bigger. So 1.05. If I save here, you'll see that nothing is showing. And that's actually because of stacking once again. So this is actually behind everything. So if I come up top here, I could change this to Z index of 0, and then you should see it starting to populate. Now, it's not quite right, and we could change this a couple different ways, but I think since I've already got this inline size here, let's just copy this up, change the inline size and the block size to make sure everything's the exact same, and then it should be even all the way around. Now, if you want a bigger blur there, you could come in here and change this to like, I don't know, 4 or something like that, and it blurs out even more, but I kind of liked it with the same blur as this background on the H2. All right, if you've hung in this long, we are almost done. I'm going to come down here and now take the review name here. We're going to change the letter spacing just a touch here to make it a little bit more readable to 0.05 rem. And then we're going to say our font size, and we're going to use that same clamp thing that we did last time, where we take here 1.3 as the smallest and 1.6 as the largest, and I'll just paste that in here. And then finally, I've got this review location. I'm going to come in here and say color var text of 2, and then we'll do a margin top of -1 rem, so it pulls it up just slightly, and then we'll do a font size here of just 0.9 rem. Oh, and I lied, I had one more thing I was going to add, just to make that body a little bit smaller so it doesn't take up quite as much space. We're going to say the review body, which is the text down there below, the quote, to be a max width of 550 pixels, and then a margin of auto. So on small screen sizes, it'll go all the way to the outside. On big screen sizes, it will only go to 550 pixels, just like this. Now you might remember we've got all these stacked up like this. We're going to translate this whole thing to the left in JavaScript. So right now I'm going to leave this, but when we come back next time, eventually we're going to have to remove this overflow hidden. But we'll get around to that in video 3, which is all about the JavaScript. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching and happy coding.